Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for, thanks for the good evening back. I appreciate it. Thank you all for coming out on a drizzly, sleety, something like that evening to listen and talk about the state budget here in New Hampshire. Really appreciate it. My name's Phil Sletten. I'm the research director at the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute. All of you saw Cole, who's the development director at NHFPI, and this is Ben. Ben Reynolds is one of our new senior policy analysts here at the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute. Yes, round of applause. I like that. Round of applause for Ben. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. I'm here to talk to you about the state budget and funding for public services in New Hampshire, where the money goes in summary fashion and where the money comes from in summary fashion, and how those public services at multiple levels of government are funded. Now, I want to talk a little bit about NHFPI. First, who's heard of us? Who knows of any? Well, all of you have heard of us, but who's somewhat familiar with us? Okay, great. NHFPI is a nonpartisan, nonprofit, independent policy research organization. We examine the state budget, state revenue, the state economy, and the economic security of Granite Staters, particularly with an eye towards those of us with low and moderate incomes in the state. We don't lobby for or against specific pieces of legislation. There are some folks in the room who may engage with legislators, at least one who is a legislator in the room, and some people will go to legislators and say, please vote for this, don't vote for this, and who are registered lobbyists. That is not us. We try to get a good, high quality information about public policy and the economy out into the world, out into the public discussion, so it can enrich and inform the public discussion. We don't receive any funding from governments, so we don't get federal grants or state dollars or local government funding. All of our funding comes from private sources, foundations, individual donors, and other organizations that support NHFPI's work. During 2025, just to give you a sense of how much we are trying to get these conversations into public, or this information to public discussion, we published more than 100 pieces of research. We had about 5,500 event attendees. Somehow we have 744,000 views on our media in a state of 1.4 million people, and we were mentioned in the news 852 times, hello counselor, in 2025. I'd encourage you all to subscribe to nhfpi.org/subscribe if you have not yet, to sign up for our newsletters. Now, in this presentation, I'm going to be talking to you about the state budget, what's in the state budget and what's funded through it, how state government is funded, where local revenue sources come from and state aid to local governments, and then how taxes, services, and other impacts from those services and those revenues are how they interact with household costs, and what are some key considerations for future budgets. So that's a lot of material. I'm going to try to get you all out of here by 7:30 p.m. That's my goal. There's a lot of material. What I have here is about 60 slides, so some of them I'll go through pretty quickly. If you are confused by a slide, or if you have a technical question about a slide, then please feel free to raise your hand. I really don't mind being interrupted, and I'd really not be talking to you for 45 minutes straight. Please ask questions. However, if you have a discussion question or a rhetorical question or something that is a bigger topic that you want to raise, maybe save that for the end after we get through the information slides. I do want to note there's a lot of information on these slides. These slides will be posted online. There are some references that are made throughout to other documents, and really if you wanted to read the state budget yourself, where some of this information comes from directly, you can find it on the Office of Legislative Budget Assistance webpage. I used to work for the Office of Legislative Budget Assistant before taking a job at NHFPI, so all the information is there. Part of what we do is translate it into a more accessible format, which I'm hoping you will find this evening. Okay, the New Hampshire state budget. Here's my question for you. What is the New Hampshire state budget? What do you know about it? Or even just what do you think about when you hear the term state budget? There is no wrong answer. Yes?
2 pieces.
2 pieces, yes. There are 2 pieces of legislation that make up the state budget. Great answer. What else? What do you think? Yes?
Not enough money.
Not enough money. Okay, it is a budget. There's a certain amount of money that's in it, although measuring that amount of money is actually surprisingly difficult. What else? Any other thoughts?
Pay for state services.
Pays for state services. Yes, it's a great answer. Doesn't pay for all the state services, but it does pay for most of them. Okay, these are great answers. Thank you. So we in New Hampshire have a 2-year or biennial operating budget. And that is different from the 30 states that have 1-year state budgets. So 20 states have a 2-year state budget, or there's a handful that actually have a slightly different schedule, but think of it as about 30-20. In New Hampshire, it funds most, but not all of state operations for 2 state fiscal years. And state fiscal years begin on July 1st. So for example, the current state budget took effect July 1st, 2025, and will run through June 30th of 2027. And it's based, because it's an operating budget, it's based on the amount of revenue projected to come in during that time period. The budget does have to balance based on revenues and expenditures. The state budget that's currently being implemented funds about a little under $16 billion in services over that 2-year period. If you were to measure the amount of money in the state budget, it would be about that $15.9 billion figure. And there are 2 pieces of legislation. The state budget is not just one thing. There's what's typically called House Bill 1, doesn't have to be, but it's typically called House Bill 1, and House Bill 2. House Bill 2 has all of the legislative language that helps, in some cases anyway, enact House Bill 1. But House Bill 1 is where the budget lines are. It might be what you think about you would see when you look at a state budget. Here's a state agency, here's all the appropriations for different operations within that state agency. House Bill 2 is typically, if you hear about something attached to the state budget, it's usually in House Bill 2, although it doesn't have to be in House Bill 2. Now, the state budget is created in a process that actually lasts about a year. So it's a 2-year budget, but for about one of those years, the state is working on making the next one. So back in the summer of 2024, to use this timeline, the state agencies were working on their budget requests. How much money do we think we're going to need for the 2 years starting July 1st, 2025? They then create their budget requests based on the spending targets put forward by the governor's office, and then the state agencies will have their budget requests made public and submit them to the governor formally. Notice this is an even-numbered year to an odd-numbered year, so everyone could change in this time period in terms of the policymakers who are elected to make policy decisions. All that could be different between this even-numbered year and this odd-numbered year, right? So February 15th is when the governor is statutorily required to introduce, in this case, her budget, and then it goes to the House. And the House has a committee that projects revenues called the Ways and Means Committee, and then a Finance Committee, which actually breaks itself up into 3 parts and works on the state budget, makes the amendments that it sees fit, and then the state budget moves to the Senate if it passes the House. It moves to the Senate, and the Senate will make the modifications that it sees fit. And if they disagree, if the House disagrees with what the Senate does, which happens most, but not all of the time, then the 2 bodies will form a committee of conference, which is when members of the House and members of the Senate and their finance committees will get together and put forth a final version of the state budget, which then goes for an up or down vote to the full legislature, hopefully before July 1st, because that's when funding for the last state budget expires. So this last budget cycle, it was June 27th that the governor signed the state budget that was going to take effect July 1st. So that is the timeline for it, but I do want to note some things the state budget is not. The state budget is not all state spending. You had a great answer before as to it funds state government, but it doesn't fund all of state government because it must balance. And there are some things that we don't necessarily want to pay for with cash. Big capital projects, big transportation projects, right? Those are funded elsewhere in the state statute. There's a capital budget, which is typically HB 25. That's a 6-year-long budget. There's opportunities for updates every 2 years. That allocates some state general fund spending, state general fund spending, and that supports projects, but this budget doesn't have to balance, right? It can bond, it can borrow money over time. There's also the 10-year transportation improvement plan, which is a longer-term plan, again, could be changed once every 2 years, that prioritizes transportation projects around the state. There could be, this is not a state budget year, right? This is 2026, so 2025 was a state budget year, 2027 will be another state budget year for the legislature. But if you're a legislator and you want to pass a bill that costs money, you can still do that, right, without going back and modifying the state budget. It's just a separate law that costs money. Right? So that's something that can be done outside of the state budget process. It doesn't have to be a state budget year to spend the dollars. State agency spending requests can also be granted by what's called the Joint Legislative Fiscal Committee. So there's another mechanism for state agencies to change their budgets mid-budget cycle, although there are limitations on what new can be added. And then there are some separate off-budget funds that are established by the legislature. So for example, the Granted Advantage Program, or what might be called Medicaid expansion under the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. That's a roughly $600 million a year program. It's not in the state budget because it was passed in a separate piece of legislation. Now, the last state budget reauthorized it, so it was mentioned, but the actual dollars aren't in the state budget itself. And that's the biggest example of something that's outside of the state budget. Okay, so what does the state budget actually fund? What does the state budget actually spend money on? There are 6 categories of state expenditures. Here are 3 of them. I'm curious how much of the state budget each of you thinks is spent on any one of these 3, and I'll take any guess. So transportation, what percentage of the budget is spent on transportation? Education, what percent of the budget? Justice and public protection, so think like state police, right? State corrections, as in the jails and the prisons that the state has. What's spent on each of those categories? I'll take any guess about any one. Transportation, I heard someone talk about. What do you think? 40% on transportation. What? 15% on transportation, okay. 5% on transportation, good. What about any other categories? Education, justice and public protection, important government functions, yes. 15 on education, okay. This is like auctioning, right? 80 on education, all right. All right, I'm sorry? Minus 80, well, no, there's no negative numbers here, right? Okay, I'll break the suspense. This is what the state budget looks like in 6 categories, right? So 2/3 of the state budget are the categories of health and social services and education. And what this reflects are the responsibilities that the state government has relative to what the federal government has and what local governments are required to do in each state. And this can be different in each state. But there is a strong fiscal relationship with the health and social services category, and there's a strong local relationship in the education category between the state government and local governments. So transportation, we heard 40 to 5%, right? So it's about 10%, just to get that out there. Justice and public protection is 12%, and then education's 22%. Let's talk about what's in each of these categories. This is the part of the presentation where I explain the state budget to you in 6 slides, okay, in terms of what's in it. So please feel free to stop me and ask questions if you have clarifying questions. Okay. Health and social services, that biggest slice of the pie, right? That was about 44% of the state budget. That is the Department of Health and Human Services, or DHHS budget, and the budget for the New Hampshire Veterans Home, which is relatively small compared to the DHHS budget. That's the largest state agency by far. Because within DHHS, what do we have? We have public health. We have communicable disease prevention. We have food safety. We have services for older adults, including public funding for nursing facilities through Medicaid and home and community-based services through Medicaid. We have mental health, alcohol and drug addiction health services, and behavioral health services. We have food assistance, such as the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Programs Administration, right? These are the food stamp benefits, as we call them in New Hampshire still. Developmental services for children and adults with disabilities. Funding for early care and early education services. So this is child care in the state, basically. Child protective and other youth health services, assistance for housing security and services to unhoused individuals, and access to health care for children, adults, and older adults with low incomes. So all of those bullets are fairly significant state operations. Many of them are funded with the help of the Medicaid program, which is a state and federal fiscal partnership. Medicaid is the single largest program the state operates. And it is more than half funded by the federal government. About 58% is funded by the federal government. There are 173,000 Granite Staters, roughly, about 12.2% of us, that receive or have access to health services through Medicaid. And in total, that cost about $2.8 billion in state fiscal year 2025. Now remember, the entire 2-year state budget was about $16 billion. But also, not all of this is in the state budget, so we're getting our Venn diagrams right here. Federal Medicaid revenue was the single largest source of state revenue. If you take it all together across the programs that are within Medicaid, that was $1.6 billion that came from the federal government last year to fund those health services for Granite Staters. So it's larger than any tax revenue source that we have. It's larger than, that the state has, I should say. It's larger than any other pot of federal money that comes in. And if you look at who's enrolled in Medicaid, you'll notice that about half of it's children. And children are actually relatively inexpensive to insure, right? Because children don't get sick in some of the same ways that those of us who are older than children do. And then adults, age 19 to 64, are about 30% of enrollees. These are adults with low incomes. So that's the Granted Advantage program or the Medicaid expansion program, which, by the way, is funded 90% by the federal government. Most of this is a 50-50 match in terms of the federal government paying 50% and the state government paying 50%. And then you can see children and adults with disabilities, individuals who were formerly in foster care, and then older adults with or without individual disabilities, and then pregnant individuals as well who have low incomes. I do want to note that some recent federal changes to Medicaid are going to change the trajectory of this program in terms of the amount of money coming to the state. KFF, which is formerly called the Kaiser Family Foundation, does healthcare research, put some limits on a funding mechanism, which I'm happy to talk about if someone has questions, but I'm not going to integrate into the main part of the presentation. But if folks have questions, happy to unpack it. That will limit Medicaid funding to New Hampshire. That and some of the other requirements and changes that are put in the Medicaid program will limit federal funding to New Hampshire by about $2.3 billion over the next 10 years. So think about that as like almost a whole Medicaid program that's taken out of the next 10-year period. Was there a question? 2 questions, yes.
We went into the Medicaid expansion with a proviso that the federal government would pay 90%.
Yes.
But that may dip below that amount.
It shouldn't, because, and yes, I'm happy to repeat the question. So the Medicaid expansion program pays 90%. 90% is paid by the federal government. Part of New Hampshire law is that the federal government must continue that 90% or the program will be discontinued automatically within 180 days. So does this jeopardize that? And the answer is probably no. And the reason for that is because this reduction stems from primarily 3 things. 1, making it harder to maintain eligibility for the program, more frequent checks for an individual enrolled in the Granted Advantage program. 2, making work requirements and community engagement requirements a part of the program that is required, right? So it's most adults who are on Granted Advantage in New Hampshire, the majority of adults are already working, but this is requiring those to be reported. And that's probably going to lead to the disenrollment of about 20,000 individuals, or I should say, enrollment being 20,000 people lower in Granted Advantage, which is, by the way, a big slice of 52,000 people, by the time we get to 2034, right? It will have eroded enrollment that way. And the third is that it reduces the amount of money the state can raise through what's called a provider tax and then match with federal funds. So none of those changes break the promise of the 90% match. But all of those changes reduce the amount of money that comes to the state from the federal government for aspects of the program and changes how the state can raise money to fund its own portion of the program that, again, the state could get around it, the state could find other ways to raise the funds, but it will likely reduce the amount of money that the federal government provides because of those limitations. So good question, complex answer, because that 90% match, that didn't change in federal statute, but a lot of other things did that will reduce the amount of money over the next 10 years going forward. Any other questions about this slide? Great question, by the way. Yes?
Generally, how does New Hampshire compare to other states as far as Medicaid enrollment?
Yeah, so we, in terms of the percent of the population enrolled in Medicaid in New Hampshire, we are on the lower end, but there's a couple different factors in that. Because this is the same income levels throughout the country, places that have lower costs of living and tend to have lower wages and incomes overall, more people are eligible for Medicaid. However, there are 10 states that have not expanded Medicaid. So that's where the comparisons get a little difficult, because all the people who are in this dark blue, if we hadn't expanded Medicaid, they wouldn't be eligible for Medicaid. And there are some very significant states like Texas and Florida, where there's not Medicaid expansion. And that affects the percentage of the population that's eligible for the program. So it's not quite apples to apples if you do that comparison overall. Great question. Any others? Okay, great. I'm happy the Medicaid slide got so many questions. Education. Education funding in New Hampshire, or that education category, funds the Department of Education, and that includes a little over $1 billion, and that's both the budgeted and spent amount, in adequate education aid to school districts. And what is adequate education aid? This is money, and so I'm using the term, notice it's capitalized, right? This is what it's called, adequate education aid. That is determined on a per pupil basis. So if you're a student in a school district, then there's a certain amount of money, a little over $4,000, that the state will automatically owe that school district for that student being a full-time student in that school district. There are also adjustments for students who are enrolled in the free and reduced price school meal program. That's usually because they have a lower income at home. If they're English language learners, there's an upward adjustment. If they have special education needs, typically through an individualized education plan, there's an upward adjustment too. That same formula is used for public charter schools as well, although there's a boost in the amount that public charter schools receive relative to school districts. The category education also includes school building aid and other school infrastructure funding, targeted special education aid for higher cost student needs, and that was boosted to about $50 million in the current state budget, which about matched the reported expenditures by school districts in the prior year. Tuition and transportation aid, education freedom accounts, and those go to fund private education costs. And there we see a different, everything else here is a budgeted number unless otherwise noted, but we do see an example here of what we see in the education funding formula overall is that the state budgets for a certain amount, but doesn't know how many kids are gonna actually show up. And it owes school districts or charter schools, or in this case, education freedom accounts, an amount in the education funding formula based on a kid showing up. Right, so that's, and education freedom account eligibility was expanded, so more kids showed up than were originally budgeted for. Yes?
How does the education freedom account amount compare to the amount that the state is required to give to a local school?
Okay, so the question was, what is the education freedom account amount compared to the amount that the state is required to give to a local school? It is essentially the same math in terms of the education funding formula. Right? So the amount that the state sends a school district for a student who, for example, is a student who's full-time and is an English language learner, that would be the same to a local public school district as it is in an education freedom account, which then the family would use for or could access to fund private education costs. Most students who are in it were already in either private school or homeschooled, but some did switch out of public school to private school, to another educational opportunity. One difference is that there are some parts of the education funding formula that are based on community characteristics. So how many students do you have? What percentage of students do you have in your district that are free and reduced price school meal eligible? How does that compare to your taxable property value per student? That is part of the education funding formula that school districts do have access to, that when you are a charter school or an individual on with an education freedom account, you don't have access to because you're not part of a public school district in the same way. For education freedom accounts, not at all, because the family or the student is the unit there. For public charter schools, there's not a district. They're a public school, but they're a charter school and not a district school. So there are a couple other parts of the education slice of the pie. The university system is $87 million, and the community college system was $68.5 million in the first fiscal year of the budget. Also, the budgets for the Lottery and Gaming Commission and Police Standards and Training Council are in the education category. Training for police officers, but you might be wondering why the Lottery and Gaming Commission. It's because the revenue from that, the excess revenue, goes to fund education. So that's why it's in the education category. And when I say excess revenue, I mean beyond their costs, right? Beyond the costs of operations and winnings. Yes? We'll get there. Don't worry. This is the spending side. These are the 6 slides where we talk about how the money's spent. We'll talk about how it's raised in a moment, but great question. Justice and public protection. So there's a long list here. First, it's the judicial branch of state government, so the state court system, and then the departments of justice, so the attorney general, safety, think like state police and the state fire marshal, corrections, state prisons, but also banking, labor, employment security, insurance, energy, agriculture, markets, and food. Why are they in the justice and public protection category? They all regulate things, and in most cases have some form of like administrative judicial rulings, et cetera. So there are some regulatory agencies that fall under this, including some relatively small agencies. You know, the banking department's not particularly big, for example, but because they have regulatory authority, they're in this category. Also, the Liquor Commission, which has regulatory authority over liquor and liquor enforcement, Judicial Council, and the Public Employee Labor Relations Board are in here as well.
Did you put licensing in there too?
I believe the Office of Professional Licensure and Certification is in the general government category, but I'm not positive. I'd have to go back and look.
It could be in public protection.
There's some of these categories, I think, have not evolved. So there's a question about, is the Office of Professional Licensure and Certification in this category? The answer is I don't know, but I don't think so. I think it's in general government. And some of these, my comment is that some of these categories are an artifact of what was convenient at the time in terms of how these agencies were allocated. Some of them could live somewhere else.
Are
Yes.
these your categories or are these state budget categories?
These are state budget categories. So these can exist, or these do exist in the state budget if you were to look at the state budget. You could find these categories in House Bill 1. Yes?
I assume the PUC is in.
Yes, so the Public Utilities Commission, where is that? That used to be its own agency, now it's in the Department of Energy. And that's part, yes, that's part of it's administratively attached to the Department of Energy, and that's why the Department of Energy, because the Department of Energy also used to include, it was the Office of Strategic Initiatives, and it was the Office of Planning and Development, and it was the Office of Energy and Planning, depending on which time period you're looking at. That Office of Energy and Planning was wrapped into the energy part of it, was wrapped into the Department of Energy when that was created during the Sununu administration, and the PUC was pulled under that as well. So that's why it's in Justice and Public Protection, because the PUC, the Public Utilities Commission, has some administrative rulemaking or ruling capability. Great question. Okay, here are the other three categories that I'm going to race through. The Department of Transportation is the transportation category. It's just the operations, though. It is not, if you're borrowing money to build a highway, that's not in, at least not fully in, the operations budget. Remember, this is the state budget. It has to balance, can't borrow money. So those long-term projects that the state borrows money for, that's not necessarily, anyway, in the budget. Because unless we have the cash to pay for it all, it's not accounted for there. Resource protection and development, there's a whole bunch in here. Department of Environmental Services, so think like water and air quality, wetlands and waterways, Fish and Game Department, Natural and Cultural Resources, that includes management of forest and land, or some forest and lands. Department of Business and Economic Affairs, travel, planning, travel and tourism, economic development, and the Peace Development Authority. And then general government includes the Department of Administrative Services, Department of the Treasury, Department of Revenue Administration, Department of Information Technology, as well as the entire legislature, the entire governor's office, the executive council, secretary of state, and several other councils and boards. So all the stuff that helps make the rest of government work well. All right, so that was a lot in 6 slides about the state budget. Does anyone have any questions before I move on to the revenue side? You've been good at asking questions as we've gone on, so I'd encourage that more. Yes?
Those 6 slides refer back to your previous pie chart.
Yep.
That showed the different amounts.
Yeah, we just went through this. So I talked about all these categories in those slides, right? So Medicaid, for example, is all in here. Funding for local public education is all in here. The banking department, liquor commission, right, in here. Transportation is all the Department of Transportation, et cetera. So you just learned about everything that's on this pie chart. And when I say everything, I mean like very high level, 40,000 feet. But you learned about what's in each of these slices of the pie, which again are official slices. I didn't make these up, right? They're in the state budget. Okay, how is this all funded? Where does the revenue come from? And you might be saying, Phil, you've been talking about revenue this whole time. Isn't it really just taxes? Well, no, it's not taxes because not everything is a tax revenue source. Revenues also collected through fees, charges, interest, and selling products, and running programs that have costs to access them for residents and citizens. And then also federal programs and grants and federal aid supply a large amount of revenue to the state government directly. And there's some money that goes directly to local governments, but it's much more important for the state government overall. So you'll notice that of all state revenue, this is state government revenue in fiscal 25, about 38% was in that category of mostly tax revenues, 62% was non-tax revenues or program revenues. So let's talk about some of those non-tax revenue sources first. Federal grants in fiscal 25 was about $3.5 billion that came into the state. Then we have liquor commission sales and services. This isn't a tax, right? If you don't go drink, you don't pay it, right? But that brought in, to the question earlier about how much money comes from liquor and lottery, that was $715.2 million in sales and services, and about $120 million went in operating profits to other parts of state government, to fund other parts of state government. This is part of why the Liquor Commission exists as a state agency. There's both the control over the supply of alcohol, and they license for wine and they tax beer, but there's control over the sale of alcohol, but the profits go to fund other parts of state government. Same with the Lottery Commission, all the profits go to fund local public education. That's $604 million in total revenues, about $208 million went to the Education Trust Fund. And I do want to note, it has been renamed the Lottery and Gaming Commission, but even the state government still refers to it as the Lottery Commission in a lot of state documents. Turnpike tolling, how many people paid a toll to get here today? Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate that. Appreciate driving that far, that you had to pay a toll to get here. That's, although I know some folks drove further and just happened to not have to pay a toll, that's $140 million in turnpike tolling. And that is for any of the if you're driving on the 89 miles of turnpike in the state, and you go through a toll, then you're helping fund those 89 miles. But that's a carve out within the Department of Transportation's authority. And then unemployment compensation. These are unemployment taxes or fees. Yes, question.
For the turnpike tolling, is that only on state routes like 16 and Everett Turnpike?
Yeah, great question.
93 is that interstate, right?
Yes, so great question. It is not only on state roads. There is, I'll summarize because some of it I know and would just be boring, and some of it I don't know, but there's a complicated relationship between what the federal government funds states and what the states can raise on tolls on roads, on interstate highways. And that stems from the Federal Highway Aid Act of 1955, where some states had already established toll roads that paid for themselves, or at least were funding some of their operations. And the federal government wanted to establish this interstate highway system and get everything to those interstate standards. So some roads that were pre-existing toll roads were allowed to remain toll roads, but were signed as interstates. This is not the story for all interstate tolled roads, but this is part of the story. So those pre-tolled roads got the interstate signage, were brought up to interstate standards, but the states were allowed to keep their tolls on them. However, new highways that were built with the federal dollars, those had to be free, at least at the time. Right, there have been some changes over time, but at the time. So there are state roads that are tolled, like 16, Spalding Turnpike, FE Everett Turnpike, right, not signed as an interstate, but there are also interstates, like 93, that have tolls on them too. And that mix is because of the history of the dance, if you will, between what the federal government pays for and what the state government pays for. There are 89 miles of turnpike in New Hampshire. Those are run by the Bureau of Turnpikes, which is within the Department of Transportation, but they are funded and patrolled too with money raised through those tolls. And by the way, those 89 miles of turnpike, you don't necessarily have to pay a toll to get on and off them. If you drive from exit 12 to exit 14 in Concord, you are on Turnpike Road, but you don't pay any tolls because the turnpike has purchased those miles from the rest of the state. So here we go. Sorry, that was a deeper dive than you wanted, but you asked the question. So that's as far as I dare go without getting boring, right? Okay. And then the unemployment compensation as well as revenue that funds unemployment benefits throughout the state. Okay, so when you are a state legislator looking, I'm saying when, so congratulations. When you are a state legislator looking at the state budget, and you're thinking about how to fund things, you might not be thinking about those categories, but you sure are thinking, where's the money going to come from and where's it going to flow to? The state budget is broken up into what's called funds. And think of these like bank accounts. Money comes in from various sources, goes out for various purposes, and those purposes are assigned in law. So the Education Trust Fund, we've already referred to a little bit. This funds local public education, adequate education aid grants. Okay? So that's where those live. Federal funds, you'll notice, it's about a third of the state budget. I've been talking about the importance of federal funds. About $1 in $3 in operating dollars came from federal funds. I know there's going to be a question, is that typical? Where are we? New Hampshire is a little below the median state in terms of the percentage of our state budget that comes from the federal government, but we aren't far off the usual. There are some states that are on the extremes, like Wyoming's like 50%. We aren't that far off where the middle is. This is pretty typical for states. And then highway fund is, especially gasoline tax revenues will go there. They're constitutionally protected and go there. Turnpike fund, where those turnpike dollars go, those $140 million. Liquor fund and fish and game fund help run operations. There are more than 200 other funds for specific purposes. And then the general fund is the most flexible pot of money that policymakers have from budget cycle to budget cycle. If you've heard about a state budget debate, it's probably about the general fund. Not always. There's plenty of education trust fund debate too, but it's probably about the general fund because that's where policymakers have the most flexibility to create a new program, to be inventive, if you will. Now, what's in that federal fund slice? We already talked about Medicaid. 58% of that comes from the federal government. Federal transportation aid is a really wide variety of programs. There's a lot in that bucket, so I'm not going to name a specific program, but know that that's a very big category of federal aid. Special education, school meals, and professional development, those are education funding streams that come from the federal government, although not all of those are funded, except for school meals. Not all of those are funded, for example, special education from the federal government. The federal government's a pretty small player in education funding. Water pollution and infrastructure funds, particularly around clean and drinking water programs. Food assistance benefits, bless you, food assistance benefits, those are 100% federally funded. So are the Women, Infants, and Children's Nutrition Program benefits. Temporary assistance for needy families is a block grant program that the state receives dollars from the federal government for, 100% federally funded. Similar with the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, certain veteran services, funding for the National Guard, those are all examples, not an exhaustive list of what comes from the federal government into the state budget. Yes?
Yes. Now, I'm just trying to get a picture.
Yes.
So on your prior slide, all right, it showed, for example, education was at 16%, but your earlier slide showed it at 22%. So is that, are we going to take like all that, those federal funds are going to go down into other agencies and things we're spending?
So the federal dollars that go to help fund education could end up in that education category, but aren't in the Education Trust Fund. The Education Trust Fund is not all education spending. So for example, that education category included money for the Department of Education, money for the university system, money for the community college system. That's not in the Education Trust Fund. The Education Trust Fund is just for aid to local public education through the education funding formula. Yes, so that's why they're different sizes, right? First, some of that education funding is from those federal sources. Second, that's a narrower purpose in the Education Trust Fund. But a great question. I like it when people are paying attention to numbers as we go from slide to slide. Thank you. Okay, so let's talk about the taxes side now. We just talked about the non-tax revenue sources. What are some of the taxes that the state has? What are some of the largest tax revenue sources? Yes? Sin taxes, okay. There's one of those that definitely qualifies. Sorry, go ahead.
Lottery, alcohol, tobacco, some limited, like marijuana medications, I think.
Okay. Yes, we do have some legalized medical marijuana, but we don't tax it in the same way that generates general fund revenue. And lottery and liquor, those we do tax beer, but lottery and liquor are non-tax revenue sources, right? Because you have to go buy something for it, right? It's a state-run program. Tobacco, however, yes, we tax tobacco at $1.78 a pack for a 20-pack of cigarettes. We also tax other tobacco products at a different rate. That is a tax revenue source, and that's on the list. What else is on the list?
Yes.
Gasoline, yes. Motor fuels, we tax those, yes? Meals and rentals, yeah, meals and rooms, same thing. Actually, it's called both in law. What else? Business taxes, okay, yes? Medicaid enhancement, that's, oh, wow. I always love it when someone knows what the Medicaid enhancement tax is before I mention it. Great answers. Okay, so here are your top 10 largest tax revenue sources that the state has. Business profits tax is the largest one. Meals and rentals tax is the second largest. Statewide education property tax is third. Medicaid enhancement tax is fourth. Business enterprise tax is fifth. We'll talk about those in more detail in the subsequent slides. Real estate transfer tax is sixth. Buying and selling houses typically is what drives that, but commercial properties also pay it. Motor fuels tax, insurance premium tax, tobacco tax, thank you, and the interest and dividends tax was 10th. It was higher on this list, but it was repealed during this fiscal year, so it's less money in fiscal year 2025 than it was previously. Yes?
Who paid a large part of interest and dividends?
Yes, so whatever, I'm on slide 23. Okay. Let's see, I'll get you there. This was not part of the mainline presentation, which is why I have to scroll through a fair bit. Okay, so the interest and dividends tax was repealed in 2025. It was phased out before then, which is why you see a little bit of a drop off. That is a tax on income generated from wealth, meaning you have to have an asset that generates income without you selling that asset, because that would be capital gains. You have to have an asset that generates income that is enough income that you've reached the tax filing thresholds for the interest and dividends tax. So if you have a bank account that earns a lot of interest, right? If you have ownership of a stock that pays a dividend, if you have certain types of pension, although most types of retirement accounts are not eligible for this. So here's what you can see is not eligible, right? These things are not taxable under the interest and dividends tax. But if you have something that if you have a mortgage, and when I say mortgage, not that you've borrowed money, but someone has borrowed money from you, you're not a bank, right? But if you were to loan someone money for a mortgage and they're paying you back, that's an example of an asset that would generate income that would be taxable under the interest and dividends tax. About 58% of the revenue in tax year 2022 came from about 2,300 filers who had more than $200,000 a year in taxable interest and dividend income alone. Right. Yes, so if you look at all of the revenue that came from filers of the interest and dividends tax, more than half of it came from about 2,300 filers who had more than $200,000 in taxable income under the interest and dividends tax alone. So not salaries, not wages, not all this stuff, right? Not capital gains. This is saying you had enough wealth to generate enough income that you had $200,000 of income that was taxable alone. And because I think I know the next question, how much wealth is that? So if you are paying $10,000 in interest and dividends tax, then you had $200,000 in taxable income because it was a 5% rate for most of its history. If you were getting a 4% return to generate that $200,000, then you had $4 million in assets that were generating that income. If you were getting the average return for the S&P 500, then you had $16 million in assets, right? Which you could probably optimize more than that average return if you wanted to. But that gives you a sense of how much, for generating this much income that's taxable under the interest and dividends tax, how much income would that be, and how much wealth would that have to be at a 12%, 5%, and then average S&P return? Yes?
Didn't that also include those who were in a, whatever the corporate structure is, whether it's an S Corp or C Corp, that you could pay yourself with dividends, significant dividends, rather than a salary, so that you take yourself out of the 34% tax bracket on the federal level, you come and get a 20% tax bracket.
Right.
And effectively it's income, but it's paid as a dividend.
Right, if you structure,
Those are the ones that I think would be.
yeah, if you structure your income as a dividend because you own the business or you own most of the business, then you wouldn't necessarily need this much wealth, but you'd have to have the value of that business would have to be sufficient to generate that income to be taxable.
You're avoiding 14% tax on the federal level.
Right.
And so done good.
I mean, yes. So if you are paying interest and dividends tax, you have to own something that's valuable enough that it generates the interest and dividends and distributions that would be taxable underneath it. Yes.
What's the term, the legislature a number of years ago put a kibosh on that scenario? It was something, I can't think of the term.
So there were some discussions of LLCs. I don't know if that's what you're referring to, or trusts is another way. Those are.
If you're in business and you give yourself a bonus.
Distribution.
To pay the general income tax, to pay the dividend tax. But they put it as a nexus or something.
Yeah,
It could be over 200 because it would be over. If you paid yourself over $200,000, then you weren't.
Yes. So at least in the business profits tax, there is a cap on that in terms of the amount that's permissible. I don't know about how that interacts with the interest and dividends tax, though. That's a good question. I mean, maybe you were in the legislature at the time, so that could have existed, but I'm not familiar with it. But for the business profits tax, yes, as an individual, there are caps on the amount that you're allowed to pay yourself before you start paying that, for example. So I'm going to go all the way back to slide 23. Thank you for your patience. Okay, so here are our top 10 tax revenue sources, right? These are not the non-tax revenue sources. These are tax revenue sources. It's a pretty diverse array of state revenues here. So here you can see the federal grants coming in, the two business taxes, which are shaded together because they're filed together and paid together. But they are eventually split out, but we don't have those details for this fiscal year. And then gross liquor commission, lottery commission revenues, right? So those aren't the profits, those are the total amount of revenues coming in. And then you can see the other revenue sources are pretty small slices of the pie, right? So other than federal grants and probably the business taxes, because that's, that amount, most of that amount the state collects for services, those are the closest that we can have to dominant slices of the pie. Okay, those two business taxes. We have the business profits tax, which is basically your typical state corporate income tax. There was a series of rate reductions from 2001 to 2023. From 2001 to 2015, it was 8.5%, and since 2016, it's been lowered to 7.5%. And then the business enterprise tax is actually a tax primarily on compensation, interest, and dividends paid or accrued. So it's basically a tax on the pay that businesses provide to their employees. It can be on other things, but businesses pay it, and it's based on the amount that they're funding their employees, right? The amount of compensation they're providing their employees. As a result, the tax base is much broader, and the rate is much lower.
So did you just say it was an income tax?
It's the business. It's not the business's income, but it's what the businesses pay to their employees. Yes, it's based on their wages. Yes, I mean, this is the corporate income tax, right? Because that's the income side for the business. But in terms of what the businesses pay their employees, yes, this is a tax on what the businesses pay their employees that the businesses pay, not the individuals. And the only reason I'm parsing is because it's whose income, right? And what are we calling income for one group versus another? As a result of it having a much broader tax base, the rate is much lower. Right, so we're talking about 3/4% in 2015, dropped to 0.55% in 2022. Now, I do want to note that nationwide, we've seen corporate income tax revenues increase. They've actually increased a little bit more slowly in New Hampshire over this time period from 2015 to 2024 than we see in the blue bar, which is New England without New Hampshire, and then the green bar is the nationwide total. So we don't have evidence that lowering these tax rates in New Hampshire has led to more income growth. For a variety of reasons, and part of that is because we haven't seen the growth in tax revenue in New Hampshire. While it has been really significant, more than doubling what we've brought in business profits and business enterprise tax in the state, that is a lower rate of growth over this time period than we see in our neighboring states and around the country as a whole. And part of the reason why we know that those corporate profits nationally are affecting the picture is we see that about a little over 1,000 filers for the business profits tax, which is our largest tax revenue source in the state. About 1,000 filers paid 3/4 of the tax revenue. Right, so we're quite dependent on highly profitable businesses that have operations in the state, or at least sales in the state that are significant enough to be taxed by the business profits tax. Now, this tax is paid after business enterprise tax is paid, so a small business that doesn't have very much profit might pay business enterprise tax first and then not end up owing any business profits tax. So that makes this a little bit more lopsided at the top end, but we know, based on the types of businesses that are filing, that larger businesses, more complex businesses, pay the lion's share of this tax revenue. There are many different types of filings. I'm not going to go through them for the sake of time, but you can see here that some of the smaller entities, proprietors and partnerships, or likely smaller entities, pay significant or a significant number of filers, right? Corporations are 39% of filers. And then there's this group called Water's Edge, or combined filers, combined multi-component filers, meaning that they're probably incorporated in multiple different places, which is why they're all collected together. So that Water's Edge slice was 7% of filers in 2023, but was 64% of the revenue collected by the business profits tax, right? Which means those entities that are likely large, complex entities likely have an overseas component. That's what in part what the Water's Edge means, because some of those Water's Edge entities actually don't have all of their calculated profits taxed, or in the math done to do the taxation. These entities are paying more than half of the revenue collected by the state's largest tax revenue source. All right, statewide education property tax. Does anyone know anything about it that they want to share?
It's controversial.
It's controversial, all right. I'll take that answer for now. Statewide education property tax was established in 1999 in response to the state Supreme Court's requirement that the state fund local public education. It raised money by setting a rate that was originally $6.60 on effectively all property in the state, although railroads and utilities are taxed differently. Since 2005, it was set to raise $363 million, with the exception of 1 year, 2023. It's not adjusted for inflation, so this inflation-adjusted graph shows that the value of that has gone down over time in terms of how much education it can buy. It requires local governments to raise this money, but this tax doesn't actually collect any revenue for the state. None of the dollars go to the state. They all offset the amount that the state is required to fund local public education in those communities. So the state doesn't collect and redistribute any of this money. It used to, but since 2011 it has not. So all of this money is raised and retained locally and used for public education.
What was the cause of that dip?
The dip is because the legislature in the state fiscal year 2023 lowered the amount that was the target by $100 million. So it was a $100 million reduction of one-time reduction in the statewide education property tax. So that was filled in with other revenue sources that funded the education trust fund. It was a one-time, effectively property tax cut in that it sent more money to local governments from other revenue sources as opposed to requiring them to be paid locally.
And this is what Republicans have blamed was a tax cut that they gave to school districts, and that school boards have been irresponsible with the funds because that ought to have been passed down as property tax relief to school taxpayers.
And I can't tell you, well, I can show you a graph later that talks about what happened in 2023, but I can't tell you the portion of this one-time reduction that was passed down as opposed to offset and used for other expenditures. Because again, the money was still raised to fund the same adequate education grants. It was just a question of what the source was. Okay, meals and rentals tax, someone got that, thank you. This is a tax you pay of 8.5% on restaurant meals, hotel rooms, and rental cars. And that's about it, really, with this one. It's pretty straightforward. It was lowered in 2021, and it was raised in 2010. So if you're looking at the graph and wondering what's happening there, that's why there's some irregularities. The pandemic also affected how much we went out to restaurants. So that was a drop there as well. And it does fund, in part, 30% of it goes back to municipalities on a per capita basis.
Isn't that the one that was frozen and?
Yes. So the original law was that 40% of the revenue was supposed to go to municipalities on a per capita basis. The state did not meet that for a very long time, developed a catch-up formula to slowly get back to that 40%, and then at varying points suspended the catch-up formula. So it was set to 30% in 2022, which is why you see a jump there. It was set to 30% from 40% and fully funded at that 30%, but at that time it was about 19 or 20%, which is where it had been for a lot of the prior decade. So it was supposed to be 40, hovered around 20 for a while. Yes?
I'm going to apologize for this first, but does that include Airbnb?
Yes, it does include short-term rentals, is the question. Yep, you're welcome.
So, Phil, though, this is what the state actually paid. If the state had actually been paying 40%, can you talk about how much, where would the top of that graph be, and how much have we been underfunded?
Yeah.
Local taxpayers?
So just to be clear, this is inflation-adjusted revenue coming in from the meals and rentals tax. So not revenue going to municipalities, but revenue the state's collecting. So as opposed to 20% roughly of this during that time period going to municipalities, it would have been 40%, right, over time. And in 2022, when the 30% was set, you can see that carve out in blue. So that's what 30% looks like. If it had been 40% all through the time period, you would see, and it was structured that way, you'd see that much more blue across that. And then the Medicaid enhancement tax, which again, I won't spend very much time on, but this is a tax on hospitals. Those dollars that hospitals pay in the Medicaid enhancement tax are then matched with federal dollars. And those federal and state dollars fund payments to hospitals for uncompensated care. And what uncompensated care is when an individual shows up and doesn't have insurance but receives care, or they have Medicaid insurance coverage and they receive care, but there's a lower reimbursement rate. Those dollars are then paid back to hospitals for that uncompensated care. The rest of it goes to the rest of the Medicaid program. This is what's limited by the federal government going forward. The state won't be able to raise as much money through this tax revenue source.
You know what the difference is?
The difference over the next 10 years, my colleague Jess Williams calculated a projection of about, if we count the amount of money that won't be raised through the Medicaid enhancement tax, it's about $1 billion. And that means there's a little bit more than $1 billion in federal revenue that won't be able to be matched with that. Okay, so what are some of the major changes that have happened over time? The business profits tax and business enterprise tax rates have been reduced. I already covered that. There was a change in business profits tax liability so that businesses that earned profits and didn't expect to during the pandemic, so they got aid from the government to help fill in gaps, but they still earned a profit. Those profits are not taxable under this change. There's a change to how the state decides what to, for interstate businesses, what is taxable under state statute. There was the elimination of the interest and dividends tax, a reduction in the meals and rentals tax, a one-time reduction in the statewide education property tax. The electricity consumption tax was eliminated. The motor fuels tax had a temporary increase from 18 cents to 22.2 cents. We are still in the period of that temporary increase. It corresponds with the I-93 expansion. And then legalized gaming has been expanded with Keno, sports betting, mobile lottery, higher ticket and wager caps, and video lottery terminals over the last 8 years or so. So a lot more money has come through the Lottery Commission over this time period. And yes?
How long was the temporary tax?
I'm sorry?
The temporary tax on motor fuel?
Oh, so this is for the period that the state has borrowed money for the I-93 expansion between Manchester and the Massachusetts border. So I think it's 30 years, but I don't know that. And
They call it temporary?
they do call it temporary, yes. We'll see when we get to the end of that 30-year period what happens, right?
It'll still be there 60 years.
The state also increased the 125 fees and fines in the most recent state budget. Most of that's coming through motor vehicle registration fees. Okay. Now let's talk about how local governments fund their budgets and their services. So here's my question for you to kick this section off. What raises more money, local governments altogether in New Hampshire or the state government? Local governments, okay, correct. And when I talk about local governments, I'm saying cities and towns, school districts, and county governments. Interestingly, if you look at the entire United States for tax revenue, remember this is just tax revenue, this is about flipped, right? So in most states, the state raises more tax revenue than local governments do.
SWIFT funds, or is that,
Here,
yeah.
the state of New Hampshire taxes include the statewide education property tax.
So the statewide rate really is the town's raising.
Yes, so you can see that here,
It's a further distortion.
right? So that's that dark blue slice, right? Oh, pardon me, dark green slice, I apologize. Here is all the state and local tax revenue raised in New Hampshire. So this is state governments and local governments. Let's set aside the federal government for a moment. Here's your business profits and business enterprise taxes, the meals and rentals tax, right? These are the really significant state tax revenue sources. But as you can see, local property taxes are almost 60% of the tax revenue raised. If you add in the statewide education property tax, because of rounding, it's about 63% of all tax revenue raised in New Hampshire is a tax that is raised and retained locally, right? It is dependent on a local property tax base. And it's a very different picture if you compare the state government and local governments. This is using the same data set from the US Census Bureau. Where does local tax revenue come from and where does state tax revenue come from? You can see the state has a pretty diverse array of revenue sources on the tax revenue side. Local governments do not. Local governments in New Hampshire can only have the powers that the state grants them. Right? So the state effectively only permits local governments to raise tax revenue, a significant amount of tax revenue through property taxes. There's some other smaller taxes they have as well, which accounts for that other 2%. I'm sorry?
Does that include the personal property?
When you say personal property tax, what do you mean?
The registration, the money you pay for registering a car.
Oh, registering cars. So that would, car registration would be a fee.
It's an excess tax that we put in 1944.
Yeah, so motor vehicle registration counts as a fee in the Census Bureau's calculation of this, right? So we'll get there in a moment. So this reflects the options that the state has written in for itself in terms of tax revenue versus what local governments have in terms of tax revenue options. Here, this is the total picture of where revenue comes from for local governments. So not just tax revenue, but total revenue. And here you can see state grants, which includes the statewide education property tax. State grants here is 23%. All other revenue, which includes those motor vehicle fees, 14%. Federal grants are about 2%. Property taxes are about 61%, right, of all revenue that comes to the local governments. Now, how does that compare to other states? Because usually people have this question. Here, this is and I want to be clear, but I'm going to show you a bunch of tables, so I want to be clear about what each one actually shows. Property tax revenue is a percentage of all state and local tax revenue, meaning what does the state raise in property taxes, what do local governments raise in property taxes, divided by all state and local tax revenue. Here you can see New Hampshire is 60%, meaning New Hampshire is more reliant as a state and local government collected entity on property taxes than any other state in the country as a percentage of its revenue. Now that's as a percentage of its revenue. What does it look like in dollar terms? If you take the total amount of property tax revenue raised, divide it by the number of people. New Hampshire's not at the top here. New Jersey is, but we're close, right? We're between New Jersey and Connecticut. And if you look at New Hampshire, it's about $3,400 per person. So this is not per household, right? If you have children in the household, it's additional $3,400, right, for each child. And then the US overall is a little under $2,000. Very different ways of raising money in some other states as well that are less reliant on property taxes, more reliant on other things. Here is the picture of state and local tax revenue per capita if we count just state taxes and then state and local taxes combined. Because we have a perception, I think, that New Hampshire is a low tax state. And if you look at the state government only, then that is true relative to other states. New Hampshire is at the bottom in terms of state tax revenue raised per capita. So again, this is just tax revenue, and it's money raised just by the state government. New Hampshire in fiscal year 22 was at the bottom. But if you include local taxes, then we're much closer to the middle. In dollar terms, it's about $1,000 per person above Tennessee, which is the bottom one in state and local taxes combined. Again, just taxes. And it's substantially further away from the top with New York than the bottom, but we're much closer to the middle in terms of our ranking, right? We've gone from 50th to 32nd if you include local taxes. And I think it's important to note that that's the average. The amount of money that can be raised by local governments varies substantially depending on what their local property tax base is. So what this graph is showing is the percentile of taxable property value per capita across the state. So here, 10th percentile, 10% of communities are lower than this, about $163,500 per person in taxable property value. Median, 50th percentile, about $250,000 in taxable property value per person. And then the 90th percentile is $750,000 in taxable property value per person, right? And 10% or higher than that. So if you're looking to raise funds for services, and you're talking about how many people you're seeking to serve and how much property value you have that's taxable, then you can see that there's a substantial variation between what your local property tax base is. And you can look at the list of communities and see that there's all sorts of individual factors that affect it. Yes?
Can you say something about Bartlett?
Sure. So here's some examples. This is Wolfboro, Bartlett, and Newbury. Wolfboro and Newbury have lakefront property that's very valuable, right? Bartlett, I believe it's Black Mountain or Bear Mountain ski area is in Bartlett. A lot of second homes, right? Which means you have property value, taxable property value, that is not occupied by a full-time resident. And that pulls you up here because it's fewer per capita, right? It's more dollars for each person who lives there full-time.
Also federal forest land.
Yes, also federal forest land, although I don't know if that counts in the taxable property value per capita part of it. So this gives you a sense of the variation, right? How easy or difficult is it for a community to raise money at the local level? Now let's talk about state aid to local governments. Education is the largest component of state aid. Again, we have that per pupil basis in terms of education funding, and we have additional money based on those community characteristics. There's, for example, the free and reduced price school meal eligibility as a percentage of the population. There's also general revenue sharing with municipalities. That's that 30% in meals and rentals tax revenue. There was a separate revenue sharing program that has been suspended. And then grants for environmental projects, particularly water and wastewater projects, highway aid for municipal road and bridge projects. And previously, the state did fund a portion of police, firefighter, and teacher retirement aid. It used to be 35%. It's been phased out, and except for 1 year since 2011, there hasn't been a significant amount of money flowing through that funding mechanism. And that's a pretty significant cost for a lot of local governments as well. So here's what the picture looks like if you adjust for inflation. From 2007 to 2025, aid that is to local governments, but not to, this doesn't include counties, and this doesn't include school districts. So here you can see in inflation-adjusted terms, what did that aid look like? Over here, 2007, 2008, 2009, the state lost a lot of revenue during the Great Recession, right? So it had these dollars flowing to local governments and then pared them back, in part because it had less money coming in the door from the Great Recession. It took a fair bit of time for those amounts to get back toward where they were before and to start rising again. The state did receive more revenue, particularly from the business profits tax over this time period, and then did some one-time appropriations, for example, one-time highway aid in 2018, and in 2023, we see retirement show up a little bit there again as well. This is aid for public education. Now remember, it's driven on a per pupil basis. The number of kids in the school districts in New Hampshire peaked in the 2002-2003 school year. So the revenue going to school districts, adjusted for inflation, has declined over time because the funding for school districts is based on fundamentally on how many kids there are in school districts. And under the state's policy, that's been going down, so aid to school districts has been going down. This is not divided by the number of pupils, this is just the total amount of aid going out the door to school districts. And you may have heard a lot of things about education funding in New Hampshire. Some of you alluded to some of those things. Where do we rank specifically on education funding? There are a lot of different ways to measure this, so I'm going to walk you through them. If we look at the total amount of revenue in dollars collected for local public education, then New Hampshire, among the 50 states in DC, ranks 10th. So we have the 10th highest number of dollars in revenue for local public education. If we look at the amount from state sources only, meaning not local governments, then we're 34th in dollars. If we look at the amount from local sources, correspondingly, we have a higher ranking. We're 4th, meaning if you just count local government revenue to local school districts, we're the 4th highest in the country. Now, if you take the total amount of revenue that's going to local public school districts and take the fraction of that that's coming from the state government, That's where we rank last. Everybody follow? I just said a lot there. This is where we rank last, which is the percentage of the amount of money that we raise for public school kids that comes from the state versus, as you can see, comes from local governments where we rank fourth in dollar terms. And what about local government revenue in general, just beyond education? So total local revenue per capita, what's the amount that our local governments raise? How does that compare to everything else? This is in total amount of revenue per capita, so total number of dollars raised by local governments divided by the number of people in the state. New Hampshire ranks about 40th, $5,100 per person, roughly, in fiscal year 2022. What about the number of dollars provided by the state government to local governments? How does that compare? If you take those total number of dollars and divide it by the number of people, New Hampshire is third from the bottom. Right? Florida is lower than us, and then Hawaii, you might be saying $256. Hawaii doesn't run local school districts at the local level. They have one statewide school district that is funded directly by the state government. So it's a very different state-local relationship because Hawaii local governments don't run their schools, right? So Florida, West Virginia, New Hampshire, right? New Hampshire's 48th on that list. Okay, what does this mean? I'm watching the time and I'm watching people's eyes. What about impacts on household costs? This is the effective tax rate from all state and local tax revenue in New Hampshire based on your income. This is for incomes in 2023, tax laws that were in effect in 2024. If you at this time were in a household or a tax unit in the lowest 20% of income earners, meaning $35,000 a year or less, your effective tax rate from state and local taxes in New Hampshire was about 9%. If you were in the middle 20%, then your effective tax rate was about 6 2/3%. And then if you're getting up to the top 5, or really the top 1%, I guess the math is right here, then you can see that's about 2.8% is your effective tax rate with $721,000 or more in income that year. The shape of this is driven primarily by property taxes. What you see here in blue is just the property taxes and what the effective tax rate is for property taxes. You'll notice, and again, this assumes a certain amount that's passed through to renters, right? That's part of this modeling. For the bottom 20%, we see a roughly 6% tax rate, and then for the middle and upper middle incomes, we see about a 5% tax rate. And I do want to note, even though we talked about business taxes being an important part of the revenue picture in the state, if you look at all the tax dollars paid by businesses and state and local taxes in New Hampshire, at least based on what the Council on State Taxation calculated, almost half of those dollars are property tax dollars, right? So the business profits tax and business enterprise tax are still a big deal, but they aren't as big a deal as property taxes. And this is the total amount of property taxes raised by local governments in New Hampshire since 2009, adjusted for inflation. So every time the bar goes up, it's gone up faster than inflation that consumers face. This isn't necessarily what local governments face. Local governments have a different collection of costs than our household budgets. But you can see it's gone up most years. 2011, it was about flat. But then we see 2021 and 2022, we see declines. What's behind those declines? One is there was pretty fast inflation during this time period. Municipal budgets may not have been keeping up, right? Could be that they set a certain amount of dollars for expenditures, but then the costs ended up outpacing that and they had to bump it up the next year. The second is the state, over the two budgets that encompass these 2 years, did provide more funding to local governments, but the biggest factor is probably the federal government providing more money to local governments associated with the COVID-19 pandemic. Remember, school districts from the American Rescue Plan Act got about 1/3 of the amount of money that they do through the education funding formula directly from the federal government, right? So that probably helped keep property taxes lower. I can't say that statistically, right? But I'm guessing here as to what we're seeing. And if we think about how costs have changed over time, this graph shows changes over 2 periods, 2005 to 2024, so 20 years, and then in blue, 2015 to 2024. How has median household income changed in New Hampshire, adjusted for inflation? How has the mortgage payment for a newly purchased median priced house, including property taxes, changed over this time period? Yes, it's 30% over 20 years, because remember 2005 was the peak of the pre-Great Recession housing market, and then 106% over the last 10 years. Right, so the price of a median priced single family house with an average mortgage interest rate for a 30-year fixed mortgage, and average property taxes has more than doubled. Center-based care for an infant and a 4-year-old, that's gone up a little bit more slowly in the last 10 years, but faster than income in the last 20. And then average expenditures for healthcare has gone up faster than median household income as well over this time period, 68% over the whole 20-year period. Now, what percentage of the state's budget's funding do you think is specifically devoted for reducing the cost of housing and childcare? We talked about the categories, right? And there were funds for these services in those categories, but what percentage do you think it is? Zero, more than zero, but small. 0.5, 2, okay, you're catching on. So it's 0.4 for housing and 0.7 for early care and education. Now, I do want to be clear, in the last state budget, housing was a little larger slice, and the amount that could be used for early care and education was a little larger. But we're not talking about very significant components larger, right? We're talking about a little less than double for housing and probably about the same slice of the pie, but a little bit more that can effectively be used for early care and education. Now, there are some parts of the state budget that did streamline the permitting process that could put downward or less upward pressure on housing prices if that does lead to more housing construction. And there are some changes in Medicaid, including premiums and co-payments, both at the state and federal level, that may make access to services less affordable for people who are on Medicaid as well. So that could affect household budgets too. Okay, the upcoming state budget, because there's another one coming in 2027. Which really, I know it's kind of snowing outside right now, but it's not that far away in the grand scheme of things. Remember, state agencies are already some of them are already starting to work on what that next state budget looks like. So there's going to be less revenue from the Medicaid enhancement tax revenue because of those federal restrictions. The state Supreme Court has also said that the state government has to pay more for local public education. What that looks like, what the timing of that is, I think is a very open question at this point. But the next time since that ruling that there is going to be a state budget is next year. Right, that there's going to be a new state budget. There are also some things that historically happened at what is typically called the Youth Development Center that are allegedly terrible things that happen to lots of young children there. And the lawsuit costs associated with that could be very significant and are already very significant. So that's an amount of money that the state would have to pay as well. There's also a new state prison for men that the state started planning in 2023 and 2024, didn't put any money in the current state budget for. We'll see if there's money in the next state budget for this roughly $600 million project. And existing tax revenue sources aren't performing very well. That could change, but that might mean a more constrained fiscal environment going forward. And if we have some broader economic challenges, that could both increase service needs and decrease revenues. So if you had a nice nap over this hour and 10 minutes I've been speaking with you, here's your summary, right? The New Hampshire state budget is 2 pieces of legislation, doesn't fund all the state services. About 2 and 3 of the dollars are on health, social services, and education, which again reflects what is the state's responsibility versus local governments and the federal government. The state depends on the federal government for a significant amount of revenue, but it has a pretty wide array of revenue sources itself. However, it's become more dependent on a few of those revenue sources, particularly corporate profits, which do vary substantially. It's a historically volatile revenue source. Property taxes are the primary way local governments fund services. And I say primary comfortably because, again, it's 61% of all revenue, and it is the most adjustable in some ways of those revenue sources. Property taxes are the dominant revenue source for public services, and that results in a wide variation in the ability to pay for those public services depending on the property tax base in your community. State aid to local governments does vary by type and does vary over time. But I think I'm hoping that if you have one takeaway from all of this, the federal budget, the state budget, and local budgets are more integrated than we often think about. Right? We think about what's happening at my town meeting, what's happening at my school board meeting, what's happening in Concord here with the legislature, and what's happening in Congress. Right? Those are all more integrated than is often recognized and discussed in the policy conversation because, as you saw, those slices of the pie where the state depends on the federal government, the state government provides money to local governments, and all of the decisions can cascade down. Right? If the federal government sends less money to the states, then is the state going to be more likely or less likely to send money to local governments? And what does that mean for services delivered at the local level? if you want to learn more. There's additional information on our website at nhfpi.org. I mentioned some of the facts that I mentioned are expounded upon in more detail here, including the Medicaid enhancement tax. And you can even follow us on social media. You can write to us. You can subscribe to our newsletter. There are some of these social media apps that I don't have, but I hear there's interesting things on them, and sometimes I watch videos on them that both inform and hopefully entertain. Yes, there's a question.
I was just going to say, I depend on revenue.nh.gov. Every time they talk about taxes in a community, to see what the property value is and what the tax rate is in that community. It's very easy to use this, very interesting.
That's revenue.nh.gov, which is the State Department of Revenue Administration, which, as you remember from almost an hour ago, is in the general government category of the state budget. So thank you. Any questions? Oh, yeah, so if you want to make a donation to NHFPI, Cole is our development director. He'd be happy to talk to you. He has some envelopes already, actually, so thank you. That was not a plant. But if you are interested in anything you've heard here, again, please subscribe to our newsletter. Actually, I think I can make it easier for you. For those of you who want to use your phones and use a QR code and are not on a newsletter already, you can put your camera on this and hopefully it'll work for you. And there's a wealth of information on our website. All the things that I just discussed here either are or will be published soon on our website. So if you want to hear, including this slide deck, so if you want to learn more and dig deeper and you felt like this was a little bit too sleepy of an environment, I turned the lights down too far, right? You missed a sentence or two, then please feel free to find it, and also email us if you have a question about where to find something. We're happy to help. We're here to be an information resource. Yes.
Thank you very much to the Fiscal Policy Institute for all of your work. Thank you for being a trusted source of neutral information about the state budget, and for all the ways that you make very complex material more accessible to people.
Mm-hmm. Can everyone hear Councillor Hill? Sorry, I'll come and help.
I was saying thank you to the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute
you need to restart.
for the ways in which that they,
thank you.
but particularly for the ways in which you make complex material accessible to regular people, because it's really up to, the state budget is an expression of our state values, and in order for us to determine whether we agree with how the state budget is operating, we have to understand it. And I appreciate the work that you guys do to be really trusted resources on very complex material.
Thank you. We really appreciate it. Thank you. Yes.
I think these road shows that you've initiated is really a great idea. I'll probably see if I can follow you around.
You're welcome to come to as many of these as you want. You notice Cole didn't charge you a fee at the door, right? So, yeah, right. Thank you. I appreciate it. This is our inaugural stop. For those of you, if you didn't have the context, this is our first stop on our 10 stops in 10 counties tour to try to get this information again to as many people as we can, because the state budget's complicated and how we fund public services is not always easy to understand. A lot of what we understand about it has been passed down through word of mouth. We have people who are a wealth of information in the room who remember something that happened, some time ago, and all of that is sort of part of the narrative of how we've decided to operate state government and local governments in New Hampshire. And putting it into numbers, putting it into charts, putting it into words that are more accessible than what you find if you go to the Office of Legislative Budget Assistant website and look up the state budget itself, that's part of what we're here to do. And we want to get this information to as many people as possible because we believe that a more informed discussion about public policy is a more enriched discussion and a more productive discussion. So if we can break it down for folks and make it more accessible, then we've accomplished our mission, or a key part of our mission. And as a result, we're trying to do it this way by coming to you, even though we didn't have to drive very far to get here from our offices today, but we'll be up in Gorham, we'll be over in Portsmouth, we'll be over in Claremont. Cole has the entire list, which I'm not remembering off the top of my head now. So if you want to follow us around, you're welcome to, but the goal is to get to as many people as we can.
So,
yes, right. If you want to.
So Phil, since, Dave Luno from Hopkinton, so since this was the inaugural event, I think it'd be great to get more people from around the state to attend these as they roll out to the 9 other, counties and locations. So maybe we can, share something that Cole posts on social media, get that out to our networks too, because so many of our friends and neighbors in towns across the state blame the school board and the select board for high property taxes. And this puts it, and you know who else blames the school board and the select board?
State.
AI. Blame the school boards and select boards during her State of the State address. But this disabuses those claims and really gets down to the facts.
This slice of the pie matters for what school boards and select boards can do, and again to go.
If that chart was shown from 1997,
Yes,
would it be fairly?
property taxes would be more, right? The state grants would be a smaller portion because that's
1997?
because that's prior to the second Claremont lawsuit. Yes. So most of the majority of funds that go to local governments are education aid, right? And
The 1997 state budget, which I should be really.
yes, you worked on, yes.
In fact, I was the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee at the time, was $7.2 billion.
Right. So if you were to
16.9, you said?
yes, so it's 15.9 was the 2-year state budget that we have currently. Yes. I don't know if you're adjusting the 7.2 billion for inflation,
I don't
but
adjust anything for inflation.
yeah.
Stop by Henniker Brewing.
Yes. Henniker Brewery is a good place if you want to pay beer tax. That's a good spot to do it.
Pay that beer tax.
So great, thank you. Yeah, interestingly, if you look at some of these pie charts back over time, you do see some of the stories of how we got to where we are today. For example, if you were to go to, if you were to show the business profits and business enterprise tax over time, that has expanded substantially as a portion of the state's revenue, particularly over the last 10 years. We've become more reliant, particularly on that business profits tax. That's it's one of the stories that you see when these pie charts change over time.
I think the crazy part of this whole thing is the only thing that's double in terms of cost of the state budget is the number of potholes we have.
We have a lot of potholes right now,
We
yeah.
don't have double the roads. We don't have double the state police. We don't have double the fish and game. How is it double?
How is it double? That's a good question.
The state population hasn't increased that.
Right, but if you're thinking about one of the things the state government does in terms of health services, for example, think about how these healthcare expenditures have changed over time, right? And that's both health services to, like health coverage for employees at the state level, and the state government provides a lot of services that are dependent on people they've hired to deliver them, and health services and health coverage provided to individuals, right? And that's why notice I spent 6 slides about the state budget, but one of them was on Medicaid alone, right? And Medicaid is, again, mostly or majority funded by the federal government, but that's still part of the state budget, right? That's still part of that, well, most of it is part of that $15.9 billion. So that's one example. I would also say, remember how I talked about the collection of costs that households face in our budgets when we're adjusting for inflation isn't quite what governments face? Not many of us have to do road construction, even in Henniker, right? Not many of us have to do road construction in our own household budgets. But the cost of that, the labor associated with that, there's oil in the pavement, right? Those things all can be very volatile over time. So I don't have a comprehensive answer for you, but I think there are some pressure points in government expenditures that we see that move faster than what we might expect if we just look at a household budget over time.
Phil?
Yes, Cole.
Will you stick around for?
Yes, I'm happy to stick around for a few questions afterwards. Cole,
We wanted.
yes, Cole's going to tell you how to sign up for things here.
Awesome, thank you all. Bill will stick around, but I do want to give folks a chance to head on home here. We do have sign up for our newsletter if you're not receiving that, some free stickers up here as well. And we'll keep in touch here, and Phil will stick around for a little bit, but thank you all for joining us tonight.